boy's hands were cold when he touched the stone. February earth crumbled away from something smooth, something carved, something that should not have been buried beneath the garden wall. His brother knelt beside him, breath misting in the afternoon chill, and together they lifted it free. A head, small no larger than a child's fist, hewn from rough grey stone with eyes that seemed to follow the light. The features were crude but deliberate, the mouth a gash, the brow heavy with some ancient intent. They found the second one moments later, buried at the same depth, facing the first as though locked in eternal conversation. The stone was cold beyond reason, colder than the February soil that had hidden it. The boys carried them inside, wiping away centuries of dirt, unaware that they had just unearthed something that had been deliberately buried, deliberately forgotten, deliberately placed where no hand should disturb it. That night, the house on Rede Avenue grew colder. Shadows moved differently, and in the hours before dawn something began to walk the rooms with footsteps that had belonged to no living thing. The Hexham heads had awakened, and the nightmare that followed would haunt Northumberland for decades to come. Chapter 1. The Unearthing. Good evening and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night has drawn close around you now, and the world beyond your window has grown still. Wherever you are listening, whatever hour finds you in this moment, let the weight of the day fall away. We are about to step backward through time, not to the grand halls of kings or the smoke of distant battlefields, but to a quiet garden in northern England where two boys once dug in the cold earth and found something that should have remained buried. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What hour has brought you here? And if this story settles well with you, if it carries you gently towards sleep or deeper into the past, consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more shadows yet to explore. Now, let us drift back to February 71, to a small terraced house on Rede Avenue in the market town of Hexham, Northumberland, where the ordinary world was about to crack open and reveal something far older, far stranger, and far more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The garden was narrow, as gardens in terraced houses often were, bordered by stone walls blackened with age and damp. The Robson family had lived there only a short time, and the boys, Colin and Leslie, had been told they might cultivate a small patch of earth if they wished, perhaps grow vegetables or flowers come spring. It was February, and the ground was hard, the sky grey with the threat of rain that never quite fell. The air smelled of coal smoke and wet stone, the scent of every northern town in winter. The boys worked with a spade and trowel, turning over soil that had not been disturbed in decades, perhaps longer. The earth came up in cold, heavy clumps, and the work was slow. They were not looking for anything in particular. They were simply digging, as boys do, with no purpose beyond the satisfaction of breaking ground. Colin's spade struck something solid. The sound was dull, not the ring of metal or the crack of pottery, but the thud of stone meeting stone. He knelt and brushed the soil away with his fingers, feeling the cold seep through his gloves. The object was small, round, carved. He called to his brother, and together they worked it free from the earth. When it emerged, they sat back on their heels and stared. It was a head, not a skull, but a carved representation of a human head, hewn from rough grey stone no larger than a tennis ball. The features were crude but unmistakable. Two deep-set eyes, a slash for a mouth, a prominent brow, and a suggestion of hair, or perhaps a headdress around the crown. The stone was pitted and worn, ancient in appearance, and cold beyond what the February earth could account for. It felt wrong in the hand, too heavy for its size, too smooth in places and too rough in others, as though shaped by hands that did not work stone the way modern hands did. Leslie found the second head, moments later, buried at the same depth, less than a foot from the first. This one was similar in size but different in expression. Where the first seemed stern, almost angry, the second appeared more sorrowful, its mouth turned downward, its eyes hollowed deeper. The two heads had been placed facing one another, as though in conversation or confrontation, buried deliberately beneath the garden wall. The boys lifted them both, turned them over, examined the rough bases where no care had been taken to smooth the stone. There were no markings, no inscriptions, nothing to indicate who had made them or when or why they had been buried in this particular spot. The boys carried them inside, excited by the discovery, and washed them in the kitchen sink. The water ran brown with centuries of accumulated dirt, and as the stone emerged clean, the faces seemed even more pronounced, even more deliberate. Their mother examined the heads with curiosity but little concern. They were strange, certainly, but Hexham was old, built on Roman foundations near Hadrian's wall, and old things turned up in gardens all the time. Coins, pottery shards, fragments of tile. 2 carved heads were unusual but not alarming. She allowed the boys to keep them, and they placed the heads on a shelf in the living room side by side, facing outward into the house. That first day passed without incident. The heads sat on their shelf, inert and silent, 2 small grey objects among the ordinary clutter of family life. But as evening fell and the house grew dark, something changed. The temperature dropped, not gradually as it does when the heating fails, but suddenly, as though a door had opened onto winter. The family noticed it first in the living room, where the heads sat. The air grew so cold that breath misted, and frost began to form on the inside of the windows despite the fire burning in the grate. The cold radiated from no visible source. It simply existed, as though the room itself had been transported to some other season, some other place. The family gathered in the kitchen instead, uneasy but not yet frightened. Houses grew cold in February. Drafts crept through old walls. There were reasonable explanations, but when they returned to the living room later that evening, they found that objects had moved. Small things. A book that had been on the table now sat on the floor. A cushion lay in the centre of the room. The heads remained on their shelf, unmoved, but their positions had shifted slightly. They no longer faced outward. They faced each other, as they had been buried. No one in the family admitted to moving them. The boys swore they had not touched the heads since placing them on the shelf. Their mother had been in the kitchen. Their father had been at work. The younger sister, who was only 6, did not go near the living room after dark. The family exchanged glances but said nothing. It was easy to dismiss one's strange occurrence. Memory was fallible. Perhaps the heads had always faced each other. Perhaps the cold was simply the season. But that night, as the house settled into sleep, the disturbances began in earnest. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, slow and deliberate, pacing from one end of the corridor to the other. The father rose and checked, but the hallway was empty, the floorboards still. He returned to bed, and the footsteps resumed. They continued for hours, never quickening, never stopping, walking a route that seemed to circle the house. The mother heard them too, and the children, all of them lying awake in the dark, listening to something that should not have been there. The following morning, the family gathered in the kitchen, pale and exhausted. The footsteps had only ceased near dawn, fading gradually as the light crept through the windows. The heads still sat on their shelf unchanged, but the air around them remained cold, a pocket of winter that refused to dissipate. The father, a practical man not given to superstition, removed the heads from the shelf and placed them in a cupboard, out of sight. If they were the cause of the disturbance, he reasoned, then removing them from view might restore peace. But the cupboard door would not stay closed. It swung open repeatedly throughout the day, no matter how firmly it was latched. The heads sat inside, visible through the gap, their crude faces staring out into the room. By evening, the father returned them to the shelf. It seemed the heads preferred to be seen. The second night was worse. The footsteps returned, louder now, accompanied by other sounds, scratching along the walls as though something with claws moved through the plaster, low breathing, deep and animal, coming from corners where nothing stood. The youngest child woke screaming, claiming something had touched her, something cold and rough like stone. The mother went to her, held her, and felt it too, a presence in the room, invisible but undeniable, radiating cold and a kind of patient malevolence. The family did not sleep that night. They sat together in the kitchen with the lights on, waiting for dawn, and when morning came, they were no longer uncertain. Something had come into the house, something that had not been there before the heads were unearthed, something that was tied to those two crude faces carved from grey stone. The neighbours on Rede Avenue noticed the change. The Robson house, once warm and welcoming, now seemed darker even in daylight, as though shadow clung to the bricks. The curtains remained drawn. The family moved quickly from door to car, eyes averted, speaking in low voices. When asked if all was well, they replied with strained politeness that everything was fine, but their faces told a different story. They looked exhausted, haunted, like people living under siege. And still the heads sat on their shelf, small and silent, their crude eyes watching everything, their presence filling the house with a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. The boys who had dug them up no longer played in the garden. They avoided the living room when possible. They had begun to wish, fervently, that they had left the heads buried, that they had never dug in that particular spot, that the earth had kept its secrets hidden. But it was too late for wishes. The heads had been disturbed, and whatever had been bound to them, whatever had slept in the cold earth for decades or centuries or longer, had awakened. The barrier between the buried past and the waking present had been breached, and the thing that walked the house on Rede Avenue was only beginning to make its presence known. The Robson family had no way of knowing that their nightmare was not unique, that in the days and weeks to come, others would experience the same terror, that the heads would pass from hand to hand, carrying their curse with them, leaving a trail of fear and unanswered questions that would stretch across England and persist long after the heads themselves vanished from record. All they knew in those first terrible days of February 71 was that they had brought something into their home, something that did not belong to the modern world, and that no matter what they did, they could not make it leave. Chapter 2, The First Night. The house had never been sent, not truly. Old terraced houses in Northumberland carried sound the way stone carries cold, every creak and settling timber amplified through walls that had stood for generations. But the silence that descended on Rede Avenue after the heads were brought inside was different. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that swallowed sound, that made the ordinary noises of family life seem muffled and distant, as though the house itself had been wrapped in wool. The Robson family noticed it first at meals, when conversation died mid-sentence, and everyone sat listening to something they could not quite hear, a tension in the air that made speech feel like intrusion. The clock in the hallway ticked more slowly, or seemed to. Time moved strangely in those first days, hours stretching thin and then snapping past in moments of confusion when no one could quite remember what they had been doing or why they had walked from one room to another. The heads sat on their shelf in the living room, positioned where the afternoon light fell across them through the window. In daylight they appeared almost harmless, two crude carvings of indeterminate age, the kind of thing that might sit in a museum case with a card reading Origin unknown, possibly Romano-British. But as evening approached and shadows lengthened across the walls, something in their appearance changed. The eye sockets seemed deeper, the mouths more pronounced, and the overall impression shifted from crude craftsmanship to deliberate malevolence. It was as though the heads had been carved not to represent faces, but to capture something and to hold it in stone, and that whatever had been captured was beginning to press outward against its containment. The mother found herself avoiding the living room after 4 o'clock, making excuses to remain in the kitchen or upstairs, anywhere that did not require her to pass within sight of the shelf. The boys, who had been so excited by their discovery, now refused to be alone in the room with the heads. They could not articulate why. When pressed, they said only that the heads made them feel watched, that the stone seemed to follow them with its hollow gaze. On the third night after the unearthing, the manifestations began in earnest. The family had retired early, exhausted by nights of poor sleep and days spent in a state of low-grade unease that sapped energy more thoroughly than any physical labour. The house fell into its strange silence, and for perhaps an hour nothing stirred. Then, sometime near midnight, The temperature in the upstairs hallway dropped so precipitously that frost formed on the banister. The father woke first, aware of cold pressing against his face like a physical thing. He rose and checked the heating, but the radiators were warm, the boiler functioning normally. Yet the hallway remained frigid, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. He stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into darkness, and heard the first footstep. It came from the ground floor, a slow, deliberate tread on floorboards that should have been empty. Another step. Another. Not the quick pad of a family member getting water or using the bathroom, but something measured and patient, walking with purpose through rooms it had no right to occupy. The father descended the stairs, his hand on the banister that was still rimed with frost. He switched on lights as he went, but the darkness seemed reluctant to retreat, clinging to corners and pooling beneath furniture in ways that ordinary shadow did not. The footsteps had stopped. He checked the front door, locked. The back door locked. The window latched. Every entrance remained secure, and yet something had walked through the ground floor, something that left behind only cold air and a faint smell he could not quite identify, something old and mineral like wet stone or earth that had never seen sun. He returned upstairs and told his wife that he had found nothing, that perhaps it had been pipe settling or the house contracting in the night cold, but his voice carried no conviction, and she did not believe him. They lay awake in the dark, listening, and before long the footsteps resumed. They paced through the house for hours, never quickening, never stopping, walking a circuit that seemed to include every room on the ground floor and then the hallway above. The family lay in their beds, frozen with something deeper than fear, listening to the thing that walked below. Morning came as a reprieve, pale February light washing through windows and restoring the illusion of normalcy. The family gathered in the kitchen, none of them speaking of what they had heard, though it was clear from their faces that sleep had been impossible. The youngest child, who had been quiet since the heads arrived, finally asked in a small voice if they could please put the stone faces back in the garden. The mother agreed immediately. The father, desperate for any solution, carried the heads outside and buried them again in the spot where the boys had found them. He packed the earth down firmly, placed a stone over the location, and returned inside feeling as though he had accomplished something, as though reburial might reverse whatever had been set in motion. For several hours, the house seemed lighter. The oppressive silence lifted slightly. The cold spots dissipated. The family allowed themselves to hope that the nightmare had ended, that returning the heads to the earth had satisfied whatever force they had disturbed. But that night, as darkness fell, they heard a different sound. Not footsteps, but scratching, as though something with claws or nails was digging in the garden. The father went to the window and saw nothing, only darkness and the vague shapes of shrubs in the garden wall. But the scratching continued, rhythmic and determined, the sound of earth being moved. In the morning he found the heads sitting on the back doorstep, dirt still clinging to their surfaces, positioned side by side facing the door as though waiting to be let in. The stone that had marked their burial spot lay several feet away. The earth had been disturbed, dug up from below as though something beneath had pushed upward. The father stood staring at the heads, and for the first time he felt genuine fear, not the abstract unease of strange noises in the night, but the concrete terror of realizing that he was dealing with something that possessed will, intention, agency. The heads did not want to be buried. They wanted to be inside the house. And whatever force they carried, it was stronger than locks or earth or human determination. He brought them back inside, placed them on their shelf, and said nothing to the family. But they knew. They had heard the scratching. They had seen his face when he came in from the garden. The heads had returned themselves, and the message was clear. They would not be banished. That night, the disturbances reached a new intensity. Objects moved violently now, not just displaced, but thrown. A vase shattered against the wall. Books flew from shelves. The curtains in the living room tore themselves from their rods and fell in heaps on the floor. The cold became unbearable, ice forming on the inside of windows, breath turning to fog in every room. And through it all, the footsteps continued, joined now by other sounds, low growls and heavy breathing, the scrape of something moving through walls, inside the walls, as though the house itself had become permeable to whatever presence the heads had brought with them. The children huddled in the parents' bed, all of them together, listening to the house being torn apart by invisible hands. The youngest was crying and the boys were pale with terror, but there was nowhere to go, no escape from something that could follow them through locked doors and buried earth. The mother held her children and prayed, not to any specific god, but to the universe itself, begging for dawn, for light, for an end to the nightmare that had begun with 2 small carvings in the garden soil. When morning finally came, the house was wrecked. Furniture overturned, pictures hanging crooked or fallen, a smell of damp earth permeating everything. But the heads sat unchanged on their shelf, their crude faces betraying no evidence of the chaos they had orchestrated. They simply watched, patient and eternal, as the family emerged from their bedroom to survey the damage and realized with dawning horror that this was not going to stop, that the heads had claimed the house as surely as they had once claimed the earth, and that everything the Robson family had known about the world, about what was possible and what was not, had been shattered as thoroughly as the vase that lay in pieces on the living room floor. Chapter 3. The Thing in the Darkness. The 4th night brought something worse than cold or footsteps or flying objects. It brought a presence that could be seen, or almost seen, a shape that moved through the house with a physicality that transcended the abstract terror of invisible forces. The mother saw it first, though she would not speak of it until days later, when the memory had settled into something she could articulate without her voice breaking. She had risen near 2 in the morning, driven by thirst and the vain hope that moving through the house might somehow break the spell of dread that kept her pinned to the bed. The hallway was dark, though she had left the landing light burning. Darkness in that house had become aggressive, swallowing illumination, pressing against windows and doorways like something with mass. She moved carefully toward the stairs, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance, and became aware of breathing that was not her own. It came from below, from the ground floor where nothing living should have been. Deep, rhythmic breathing, the kind that belonged to something large, something with lungs that moved air in quantities no human chest could manage. She froze at the top of the stairs, her hand on the banister, and looked down into the darkness of the entrance hall. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then the darkness moved. Not shadows shifting, but a solid mass, darker than the surrounding blackness, moving with purpose across the hall from the living room toward the kitchen. It walked on 4 legs, or seemed to, though the gait was wrong, too fluid, too purposeful for any animal she knew. The shape was roughly the size of a large dog, but the proportions were distorted, the back higher than the front, the head too large and held too low. She could see no details, no eyes or features, only the outline of something that should not exist, something that moved through her house as though it belonged there more than she did. She did not scream. Terror had moved beyond sound, beyond reaction, into a kind of paralysis that rooted her to the spot. She watched the shape move across the hall and pass through the kitchen door without opening it, simply merging with the wood and disappearing as though the door were no more substantial than fog. The breathing stopped. The house fell silent. She stood at the top of the stairs for uncounted minutes, unable to move, unable to process what she had witnessed, until finally her husband's voice called from the bedroom asking if she was all right. She returned to bed and said nothing, but she did not sleep, and in the grey light of dawn she looked at herself in the mirror and saw that her hair, which had been brown the day before, had begun to turn white at the temples. She was 34 years old. The children saw it next, 2 nights later. The boys shared a room at the back of the house, their beds positioned against opposite walls with a window between that looked out over the garden. They had been lying awake, as they did every night now, listening to the house settle and creak and move with sounds that were not settling or creaking. The room was cold despite the radiator that ticked and hissed beneath the window. Their breath fogged the air. Neither boy spoke, but both were awake, both listening, both waiting for dawn with the desperate patience of prisoners awaiting execution. Then the door to their room opened, not violently, not with the dramatic flare of wind or supernatural force, but slowly, as though something were being careful, testing whether the hinges would squeak, whether opening the door would alert the occupants. The boys watched from their beds as the door swung inward and the shape entered. It came on 4 legs, its body low to the ground, moving with a kind of liquid grace that suggested muscle and sinew beneath whatever dark surface composed it. The head swung from side to side as though scenting the air, though the boys could see no nose or mouth, only the vague impression of features in the deeper darkness of its face. It was the size of a large wolf, perhaps larger, and it moved into the room with complete confidence, claiming the space as though it had every right to be there. The boys lay frozen, covers pulled to their chins, watching as the thing paced between their beds, its breathing audible now, deep and wet, like something that had been underwater and was surfacing for air. It paused at the foot of Colin's bed and seemed to study him, though it had no eyes that he could discern, only hollows where eyes might have been. Then it moved to Leslie's bed and did the same, its head tilting in a gesture that was almost curious, almost playful, and far more terrifying than any display of aggression could have been. The creature completed its circuit of the room and approached the window. For a moment it stood in silhouette against the faint light from the street, and the boys saw its outline clearly. The back was indeed higher than the front, giving it a hunched appearance. The head was massive, nearly the size of the torso, and the legs were oddly jointed, bending in ways that animal legs did not bend. Then it turned and looked at them, both of them, with whatever served it for vision, and Leslie would later swear that it smiled, that the darkness of its face rearranged itself into an expression of satisfaction or amusement. It moved toward the door, passed through it without opening it, and was gone. The boys remained in their beds, unable to move, unable to speak, until morning light finally crept through the window and released them from paralysis. When they told their parents what they had seen, the mother began to cry, not with surprise but with recognition, and the father sat down heavily at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. That afternoon a family meeting was held. The heads had to go, not buried in the garden where they could return, but removed from the property entirely, given away or destroyed or taken somewhere far from Rede Avenue. But no one wanted to touch them. The very thought of picking them up, of feeling that cold stone against skin, was unbearable. The father, summoning reserves of courage he did not know he possessed, wrapped the heads in newspaper and placed them in a cardboard box. Even through the paper they radiated cold. He carried the box to the car, placed it in the boot, and drove to the home of a colleague who had expressed interest in local antiquities. The colleague accepted the box with enthusiasm, unaware of its history, pleased to have acquired what he assumed were genuine archaeological artifacts. The father returned home and told the family that the heads were gone, that they were someone else's problem now, that perhaps with them gone the house would return to normal. For one night peace descended. The house was quiet. The temperature normalized. The family slept, truly slept, for the first time in more than a week. But the following evening the colleague telephoned, his voice tight with anger and fear. Strange things had begun immediately in his house, he said. Objects moving, cold spots. His dog had refused to enter the room where the heads were displayed and had spent the night barking at the door. His wife was frightened. Children were having nightmares. He wanted the heads removed immediately. The father agreed and drove to collect them, apologizing but offering no explanation. The heads returned to Rede Avenue, and with them came the creature, as though it had merely been visiting elsewhere and now resumed its residence. That night it walked the hallway outside the children's rooms, its heavy tread shaking the floorboards, its breathing rattling in its throat like water in pipes. The family gathered in one room again, all 5 of them pressed together, listening to the thing that owned their house, that had claimed their lives, that walked and breathed and watched from darkness with a patience that suggested it had all the time in the world. The father began to research in desperation, visiting the local library, reading about standing stones and Celtic head cults, about Romano-British religion and the significance of carved faces in ancient Britain. He learned that heads held sacred power in Celtic belief, that they were thought to contain the soul or essence of a person, that severed heads were displayed as trophies and carved heads placed at boundaries between worlds, guards against evil or conduits for spirits. He read about the Hexham area, about its position near Hadrian's wall, about the layers of history buried in Northumberland soil, Roman and Celtic and older things still, peoples who had lived and worshipped and died in these hills long before names were written down. He read until the library closed, and then sat in his car in the car park, the books beside him, understanding that he had found no answers, only confirmation that the world was older and stranger and more full of shadows than modern life acknowledged. The heads were old, or seemed old, and they carried something with them, some residue of belief or power that had not diminished with time. And whatever walked his house was tied to them, bound to them, perhaps contained in them, as the Celts had believed the soul was contained in the head. He returned home after dark, and before he reached the front door he saw it in the window. The creature sitting in the living room, its shape black against the lamplight, its massive head turning to watch him approach. It was waiting for him, he realised. It was waiting. It lived in the house now, as much as the family did, perhaps more. And there was nowhere to go, no way to escape something that could pass through walls and doors, that could be buried and return, that could be given away and come back. The Robson family was trapped in their own home with a thing from the dark earth, and the only witnesses to their nightmare were two small carved heads that sat on their shelf and watched everything with stone eyes that never closed, never blinked, never showed mercy or understanding or any human emotion at all. Just the patient, eternal gaze of stone that had seen centuries pass and would see centuries more, indifferent to the suffering of those who had disturbed its long sleep in the cold ground. Chapter 4. The Neighbour's Terror. The houses on Rede Avenue shared walls, as terraced houses do, and sound travelled between them with perfect clarity. Mrs. Ellen Dodd, who lived next door to the Robsons, had been aware for some time that something was wrong in the adjoining house. She heard the footsteps at night, the crashes and bangs, the occasional crying of children. She had nearly knocked on their door several times to ask if everything was well, but something always stopped her. Some instinct that warned against becoming involved in whatever was happening beyond the shared wall. She was a widow, living alone with her grown daughter who worked nights at the hospital, and she prided herself on minding her own business. But as the disturbances in the Robson house intensified, it became impossible to ignore. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with whatever force was being unleashed next door, and more than once she had placed her hand against the plaster and felt it cold, far colder than brick should be, as though the wall were separating her from winter itself. Then one night in early March, the manifestation crossed the boundary. Mrs. Dodd was alone in the house, her daughter at work, and she had gone to bed early with a book and a cup of tea. The bedroom was at the back of the house, directly adjacent to where the Robson boys slept, and she had just switched off the lamp and settled into the pillows when she heard the breathing. It was the same deep, wet breathing that the Robson family had come to know, but she had no context for it, no preparation. She sat up in the dark, listening, trying to identify the source. It seemed to come from inside the walls, or from the corner of the room where her wardrobe stood, or from everywhere at once. She switched the lamp back on, and the breathing stopped. She sat in the light, heart racing, telling herself it had been the pipes or the wind or her imagination. She switched the lamp off again, and the breathing resumed immediately, closer now, as though whatever was producing it had moved nearer while the light had been on. She left the lamp burning and tried to sleep, but sleep was impossible. She lay listening to this breathing that continued despite the light, that seemed to be circling the room, moving along the walls on a slow patrol. Near midnight she heard her daughter's key in the front door and the familiar sound of her footsteps on the stairs. The bedroom door opened, and her daughter stood framed in the doorway, her face pale. She had heard it too, she said. The breathing. It had been in the hallway when she entered the house, moving up the stairs ahead of her, and when she had switched on the light, she had seen something. A shadow that was darker than shadow, shaped like an animal but wrong in some fundamental way, disappearing into the wall that separated their house from the Robsons. The two women sat together on the bed, neither speaking to her, until dawn light began to show through the curtains and the breathing finally ceased. The following morning, Mrs. Dodd knocked on the Robson door. The mother answered, looking exhausted, her hair noticeably greyer than it had been weeks before. Mrs. Dodd described what she had experienced, and the Robson mother invited her inside into the living room where the heads sat on their shelf. Mrs. Dodd looked at them, these small crude carvings that seemed so innocuous in daylight, and listened as the story poured out, the unearthing and the footsteps and the creature that walked the house and the failed attempts to be rid of the heads. She listened with growing horror, not because she disbelieved, but because she recognized the truth of it. She had heard the thing, her daughter had seen it. Whatever the Robsons were experiencing was not confined to their house, was not contained by walls or boundaries, and was spreading like a contagion to the adjoining properties. That night the creature came to Mrs. Dodd's daughter's bedroom. The young woman was sleeping, exhausted from her shift at the hospital, when she woke to find something in the room with her. It stood at the foot of the bed, darker than the darkness around it, its shape impossibly clear despite the absence of light. She could see the massive head, the hunched back, the legs that bent wrong. It stood perfectly still watching her, and she lay paralyzed, unable to move or scream or even close her eyes. The breathing was deafening in the silence, each inhalation seeming to draw air from her own lungs, each exhalation pressing against her chest like a weight. She did not know how long it stood there, minutes or hours, time lost meaning in the presence of the thing. Then it turned, walked to the wall that separated her room from the Robson house, and passed through the plaster as though the wall were not there. She heard it moving in the space between walls, heard its claws or paws or whatever saw it walked on, scraping against brick and timber, heard it breathing in the darkness between houses, patrolling a territory that included both properties now, both full families, all the people who lived within range of the heads that sat on their shelf next door. She left the Chateau house the following morning and did not return for 3 days, staying with friends and refusing to explain why. When she finally came back, she found her mother pale and shaken, reporting that the breathing had continued every night, that things had moved in the house, that the cold had spread from the shared wall throughout the rooms, that she could not bear to be alone after dark. The daughter contacted the Robsons and asked to see the heads. She was a rational woman, trained in medicine, sceptical of superstition, but she knew what she had seen and she wanted to understand what they were dealing with. The Robson mother brought the heads to the shared fence in the back garden, unwilling to let them leave the property after previous attempts at removal had failed. The daughter examined them in daylight, turning them over, noting the crude carving, the weight, the cold that emanated from the stone. She asked where they had been found, how deep, whether anything else had been buried with them. She took photographs, careful documentation, as though evidence might provide protection, as though recording the nightmare might diminish its power. But the documentation changed nothing. That night, the creature returned to both houses, moving between them freely now, walking through walls with impunity. The families could hear it in the spaces between, in the walls and floors and ceilings, as though their houses had been hollowed out and converted into burrows for something that belonged to the earth, to the time before houses, before streets, before the modern world had paved over the ancient landscape. Mrs. Dodd began sleeping at her sister's house, returning only during daylight hours to collect mail and check on the property. Her daughter gave notice at the hospital and moved to Newcastle, unable to continue living in a place where walls meant nothing, and darkness brought visitors from some realm that should not have intersected with the waking world. The Robson family remained, trapped by circumstance and the impossibility of explaining to potential buyers or landlords why they needed to leave, why their house was uninhabitable, why no amount of money could compensate for what they were experiencing. The manifestations intensified in both properties. Objects flew in synchronized violence, as though the creature was moving between houses and wreaking havoc on both sides of the shared wall. The cold became permanent, unaffected by heating or season. March gave way to April, and still frost formed on windows, still breath misted in every room. The neighbours on the other side of the Robson house began to report disturbances. The family across the street mentioned strange sounds. The contagion was spreading, radiating outward from the two small heads that sat on their shelf like stones dropped in still water, the ripples of their presence expanding to encompass an entire neighbourhood. People who had never believed in ghosts or spirits or anything beyond the material world found themselves confronting something that defied explanation, that broke the rules of reality so thoroughly that denial became impossible. The heads had brought something with them from the earth, something that had been contained or sleeping or imprisoned, and now it was loose, growing stronger, claiming more territory, feeding perhaps on fear or attention, or simply the fact of being acknowledged after centuries of burial in the dark ground. The Robsons contacted a priest, then a medium, then anyone who claimed knowledge of the supernatural or the ability to cleanse haunted spaces. The priest blessed the house and left quickly, visibly shaken, refusing payment and suggesting they contact the diocese for assistance with what he called a serious spiritual infestation. The medium entered the house, took one look at the heads, and departed without performing any ritual, saying only that some things were beyond her skill, that the heads contained something older than her tradition could address. A local historian came, examined the heads, declared them probably modern and of little archaeological value, and then experienced 3 nights of violent disturbances in his own home, before returning them with a written note saying he wanted nothing more to do with them. Every attempt to solve the problem, to understand or contain or dispel the force that the heads had released, ended in failure, and through it all, the creature continued to walk, to breathe, to watch from darkness, to remind the families that their houses were no longer their own, that something far older had claimed them, and that the thin veneer of modern civilization was exactly that, a veneer, beneath which lay the same shadows and terrors that had haunted the landscape for thousands of years, waiting in the earth for someone to dig deep enough to let them back in. Chapter 5. The Heads Depart. By late April, the Robson family had reached the limits of human endurance. Sleep had become impossible. Not merely difficult, but physically impossible, as though the presence in the house had learned to prevent rest, to keep its inhabitants in a state of perpetual exhaustion that ground away at sanity like water-wearing stone. The father had taken leave from work, unable to function, unable to explain to his employer why he arrived each morning grey-faced and trembling. The mother had stopped cooking, stopped cleaning, stopped maintaining the rhythms of domestic life that had once structured her days. The children were withdrawn, silent, moving through the house like ghosts themselves, speaking only in whispers as though afraid to draw attention from whatever walked the rooms. The youngest had stopped speaking entirely. She communicated through gestures and written notes, and when asked by a concerned teacher why she no longer used her voice, she wrote only, It might hear me. The decision to leave came not through rational discussion, but through collective breakings. Point. One morning in late April, the father simply announced that they were moving to his brother's house in Durham, that they would stay there until they could find another property, that the house on Rede Avenue was no longer habitable, and that no force on earth could compel them to spend another night under its roof. The family packed essentials in a frenzied rush, throwing clothes and necessities into suitcases, abandoning everything that could not be carried immediately. They did not discuss the heads. The heads sat on their shelf watching the preparations with their stone eyes, and no one touched them, no one acknowledged them, as though by ignoring their presence the family might slip away unnoticed. But as they carried the last suitcase to the car, the youngest child turned back toward the house and pointed at the window. The creature stood there, clearly visible in the afternoon light, its dark shape pressed against the glass, its massive head tilted as though in farewell, or perhaps threat. The family drove away without looking back, and behind them the house stood empty, the heads waiting inside like sentinels guarding a territory that had been hard won and would not be easily surrendered. The house remained vacant for 3 months. The landlord, informed only that the family had experienced difficulties and would not be returning, attempted to show the property to potential tenants, but found the task impossible. Prospective renters entered and left quickly, offering vague excuses about the layout or the location, but unable to articulate the real reason they would not consider living there. The house felt wrong. Even estate agents, professional dissemblers trained to present properties in the best light, could not bring themselves to spend more than a few minutes inside. The cold persisted despite summer heat. The silence was oppressive, and everyone who entered reported the same sensation of being watched, of not being alone, of intruding on a space that was occupied by something that did not welcome human presence. The landlord, desperate and increasingly suspicious that the Robsons had not told him the full story, finally entered the property himself to investigate. He found the heads immediately, still sitting on their shelf in the living room where they had been abandoned. He picked them up, meaning to dispose of them, and felt the cold radiate through his hands like electricity. He carried them outside and left them on the curb with the rubbish, wanting them gone, wanting the house cleansed of whatever taint they carried. The heads disappeared within hours, taken by a passer-by who recognised them as potentially old and therefore potentially valuable. This man, a dealer in antiques and curios, had no knowledge of their history and saw only opportunity. He took them to his shop in Corbridge, cleaned them properly for the first time since their unearthing, and displayed them in his window with a card reading Celtic Heads circa 200 AD, offers invited. They sat in the window for 2 days, attracting considerable interest from tourists and collectors who admired their crude artistry and speculated about their origin. On the 3rd day, the dealer arrived at his shop to find the window smashed from inside, glass scattered across the pavement, and the heads sitting on the doorstep facing the street as though they had broken free and positioned themselves to be found. No other items had been taken, nothing else in the shop had been disturbed. Only the heads had moved, and they had done so with enough force to shatter reinforced glass. The dealer, a pragmatic man not given to superstition, nevertheless felt the first stirrings of unease. He brought the heads back inside, placed them on a high shelf away from windows, and decided to research their provenance before attempting another sale. That night, his shop came alive with the same phenomena that had plagued Rede Avenue. Footsteps echoed through empty rooms. Objects fell from shelves. The temperature dropped until his breath misted in the June warmth. He returned the following morning to find chaos, merchandise strewn across the floor, display cases overturned, and the heads sitting on the counter at the front of the shop where he would see them immediately upon entry. The message was clear. They wanted to be found, they wanted to be seen, they wanted acknowledgement. He contacted the local museum, explaining that he had acquired 2 carved heads of possible archaeological significance and asking if they might be interested in examination or acquisition. The museum sent a junior curator, a young woman recently graduated from university and eager to prove her competence. She arrived at the shop, examined the heads with professional interest, and pronounced them fascinating examples of Romano-British folk art, possibly grave goods or household protector spirits. She offered to take them to the museum for further analysis, and the dealer agreed with embarrassing eagerness, wanting them gone, wanting his shop returned to normalcy, willing to accept any explanation that did not require acknowledging that objects could move themselves and break glass from inside locked buildings. The heads spent 2 weeks at the museum in Newcastle, photographed and measured and studied by experts who debated their age and origin. Opinion divided between those who believed them genuinely ancient and those who suspected modern forgery. The stone was consistent with local quarries, but the carving style was difficult to date with precision. They could have been made 2,000 years ago or 20. The erosion patterns suggested age, but erosion could be artificially induced. No consensus emerged, and the heads remained in the museum basement, stored in a box with other items awaiting classification. During those 2 weeks, the museum experienced no disturbances. The heads sat quiet and inert, as though satisfied with their new environment, or perhaps simply resting, gathering strength. But when the curator attempted to move them to permanent storage in a facility outside Newcastle, the disturbances resumed with violent intensity. The vehicle transporting them broke down 3 times on the same stretch of road. The driver reported seeing something large and dark crossing the motorway ahead of him, something that caused him to brake hard and swerve, though no other drivers reported seeing anything unusual. When the van finally reached the storage facility, workers refused to unload the crate containing the heads, claiming it was too cold to touch, that frost had formed on the exterior despite the summer heat. The heads returned to the museum, and the curator, now badly frightened, contacted Dr. Anne Ross, a Celtic scholar at Southampton University who specialised in the religious significance of head cults and carved stones. Dr. Ross had published extensively on the subject and was considered Britain's foremost authority on Celtic symbolism and ritual. She agreed to examine the heads and travelled to Newcastle in July, bringing with her equipment for detailed analysis and photography. When she first saw the heads, she experienced immediate recognition, not of the specific objects but of their type and significance. These were cult objects, she told the curator, items used in ritual practice, possibly guards placed at boundary sites or offerings left at sacred springs. Whether genuinely ancient or modern recreations did not diminish their power, she explained, because power in such objects derived not from age but from belief, from the accumulated weight of attention and intention. If these heads had been treated as sacred, if they had been buried with ceremony and purpose, then they retained that charge regardless of when they had been carved. She asked to take them to Southampton for more extensive study, and the curator, desperate to be free of them, agreed immediately. Dr. Ross transported the heads south in her own vehicle, carefully packaged in a wooden box that she placed on the passenger seat beside her. The drive was uneventful until she reached the outskirts of Southampton, near dusk. The temperature inside the car dropped precipitously, and she became aware of breathing in the back seat, slow and deep, the breathing of something large. She glanced in the mirror and saw darkness, solid darkness, occupying the space behind her. She drove faster, trying to reach home before full dark, and the breathing grew louder, closer, as though whatever produced it was leaning forward between the seats. She arrived at her house as the last light faded from the sky, grabbed the box containing the heads, and ran inside, slamming the door and locking it with shaking hands. She placed the box on her desk in the study and stood looking at it, understanding for the first time that she had brought something into her home, something that the museum had been desperate to be rid of, something that every previous owner had tried to pass along to someone else. She had taken the heads willingly, professionally, and now she was alone with them in her house, and night was falling. Chapter 6. The Scholar's Inquiry. Dr. Anne Ross sat in her study in Southampton, the box containing the heads on the desk before her, and tried to apply rational thought to a situation that had already moved beyond rationality. She was a scholar, trained in archaeological method and historical analysis, and she had spent her career studying the remnants of Celtic religion with academic detachment. She knew the theories about head cults, about the Celtic belief that the head contained the soul, that severed heads were displayed as trophies and carved heads served as guardians and conduits to the other world. She had examined hundreds of carved stones, had written papers on their symbolism and distribution, had lectured on their significance. But all of that knowledge had been abstract, removed by millennia from the living practice of the religion she studied. Now, sitting alone in her house with the 2 small stone heads that radiated cold and seemed to watch her with their crude, hollow eyes, she understood that there was a difference between studying belief and encountering its consequences. The heads were not merely artifacts. They were active, potent, and they had brought something with them, something that did not belong in the 20th century, something that her academic training had not prepared her to face. She opened the box carefully, feeling the temperature drop as the heads were exposed to air. They sat nestled in packing material, facing each other as they had been buried, as they always seemed to arrange themselves when left alone. She lifted one out and held it, feeling the weight, examining the carving in lamplight. The stone was cold beyond any natural coldness, cold that burned where it touched skin. The features were crude but expressive, the mouth a gash, the eyes deep hollows, the overall impression one of age and malevolence. She took photographs from multiple angles, noting the tool marks, the erosion patterns, the mineral composition. She measured and weighed and documented, trying to lose herself in the familiar rituals of academic study, trying to ignore the fact that the temperature in the study had dropped to the point where her breath fogged and frost was forming on the window. When she replaced the first head in the box and lifted the second, she felt it resist, or imagined she felt it resist, as though the stone did not want to be handled, did not want to be examined. She completed her documentation quickly and returned both heads to their box, closing the lid with relief. That night, she woke to footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom. Slow, heavy footsteps, walking the length of the corridor and then returning, pacing with the same patient rhythm that the Robson family had learned to dread. She lay listening, telling herself it was imagination, that the stress of the drive and the atmosphere of the heads had affected her perception, that there was a rational explanation. But when the footsteps stopped outside her door and the handle began to turn, she sat up in bed, heart racing, and watched the door slowly open. Nothing entered, or nothing she could see, but the temperature in the room plummeted, and she heard breathing, the same deep, wet breathing that had been in her car coming from the doorway, from the darkness of the hall. She switched on the lamp, and the breathing stopped. The door remained open, but the hall beyond was empty. She rose and closed the door, locked it, though she knew locks meant nothing to whatever walked her house, and sat on the bed with the light burning, until dawn showed through the curtains, and the house grew quiet. Morning brought no relief from understanding, only daylight in which to process the night's events. She made coffee and sat in her kitchen, trying to think clearly, trying to apply methodology to madness. She telephoned colleagues, describing the heads in academic terms, asking for opinions on their age and origin. She contacted museums, inquiring about similar finds and documented cases of carved heads producing unusual effects. She researched the history of Hexham, reading about the Roman occupation, the Celtic settlements that predated Roman arrival, the layers of belief and practice that had accumulated in Northumberland over millennia. She found references to sacred springs and boundary stones, to heads carved as guardians at liminal spaces where the human world met the other world. She found accounts of Celtic druids who practiced divination through severed heads, who believed that skulls retained consciousness and could prophesy. She found folklore about cursed objects and items that carried misfortune, though most of these tales were dismissed by modern scholarship as superstition and peasant anxiety. But she found nothing that explained what was happening in her house, nothing that provided a solution or suggested a method of containment or dispelling. The second night was worse. The footsteps came earlier, beginning soon after sunset and continuing for hours. Objects moved throughout the house, books falling from shelves, pictures tilting on walls, doors opening and closing. The cold spread from the study where the heads were kept, permeating every room, turning her home into a winter landscape despite the July heat outside. Near midnight she heard scratching at her bedroom door, as though something with claws was trying to gain entry. She pressed herself against the headboard, covers pulled tight, listening to the scratching that went on, methodical and patient, the sound of something that had all the time in the world and knew that eventually the door would yield. When the scratching finally stopped, she heard it moving through the house, heard its heavy tread on the stairs, heard it breathing in the rooms below. She did not sleep. She sat with every light in the bedroom burning, waiting for dawn, and when morning finally came, she found scratches on the outside of her bedroom door, deep gouges in the wood as though something with claws or talons had indeed been trying to force entry. She contacted a colleague who specialised in folklore and the supernatural aspects of Celtic religion, a man who had studied residual beliefs and practices that survived into the Christian era. She described the heads and the manifestations without mentioning that they were currently in her house, framing the discussion as theoretical inquiry. He listened carefully and then told her something that made her blood run cold. In Celtic practice, he explained, carved heads were sometimes used as prisons, containers for spirits or entities that had been captured and bound. The heads were not representations but restraints, stone cells holding something that might otherwise roam free. If such a head were properly made and properly buried with appropriate ritual, the entity within could be contained indefinitely, held in the earth where it could do no harm. But if the head were disturbed, if it were dug up and removed from its burial site, the binding might weaken or break entirely, releasing whatever had been imprisoned. The heads from Hexham, he said, if they were genuine cult objects, might be exactly such containers, and their unearthing might have freed something that had been buried specifically to prevent it from walking the world. Dr. Ross sat in her study after the call ended, looking at the box on her desk, understanding with horrifying clarity what she had brought into her home. Not artifacts, not objects of historical interest, but prisons, and she had opened them, or their unearthing had opened them, and now the inmates were loose and she was alone with them in a house that had become a cage. That night, she saw the creature for the first time. She had been working late in her study, documenting her findings, trying to maintain academic distance from personal terror. The lamp on her desk was the only light in the house, creating a small island of illumination in surrounding darkness. She became aware of presence, of being watched, and looked up to find it standing in the doorway. The shape was darker than shadow, solid and massive, with the same hunched back and oversized head that others had described. It stood perfectly still, watching her, and she sat frozen at her desk, unable to move, unable to look away. They regarded each other across the space of the study, woman and the creature, scholar and thing from the dark earth, and in that moment she understood that all her knowledge, all her academic training, all her expertise in ancient religion meant nothing. She was face to face with something that predated scholarship, that existed outside the frameworks of modern understanding, that was as real and present as the desk beneath. Her hands. The creature moved forward into the study, and she pressed back in her chair, but there was nowhere to go, no escape. It approached the desk, moving with that liquid grace that suggested too many joints or joints that bent in impossible directions. It lowered its massive head to the box containing the stone heads, and she heard it breathing, smelling them perhaps, recognizing them. Then it raised its head and looked at her again, and though it had no eyes that she could see, she felt its gaze, felt its attention focused on her with an intensity that was almost physical. It turned and walked to the window, a window on the second story of her house, and passed through the glass without breaking it, simply merging with the material and disappearing into the night beyond. She sat at her desk, shaking, understanding that it had shown her something, had demonstrated that walls and windows and locked doors meant nothing, that it could come and go as it pleased, that her house was no longer her own. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the study with all the lights burning, watching the box, waiting for dawn, and when morning came she made the decision that every previous owner of the heads had made. They had to go. They had to be someone else's problem. She could not keep them. Chapter 7. Ancient Origins. The question of what the heads actually were, where they had come from, and what they represented became the subject of intense debate and investigation throughout the summer of 1971. Dr. Ross, despite her terrifying experiences, maintained her scholarly obligation to study the objects she had taken into her care. During daylight hours, when the house was quiet and the presence that walked at night seemed absent or dormant, she conducted exhaustive analysis of the heads, photographing them in detail, measuring every aspect of their construction, comparing them to known examples of Celtic and Romano-British carved stones. She consulted with geologists about the stone composition, with archaeologists about the tool marks and carving techniques, with historians about the cultural context of head worship in ancient Britain. The results were frustratingly inconclusive. The stone was local, consistent with Northumberland quarries that had been worked for millennia. The carving showed tool marks consistent with hand chiseling, but whether ancient or modern tools could not be definitively determined. The erosion was significant, but erosion could be natural or artificially induced. Every test, every analysis yielded ambiguous results that supported multiple theories without confirming any single explanation. The historical context, however, was rich and suggestive. The Hexham area had been continuously occupied for thousands of years, from Stone Age settlements through Celtic tribes to Roman occupation and beyond. Hadrian's Wall ran nearby, that great boundary between Roman civilization and the barbarian north, a physical manifestation of the border between ordered world and chaos. The wall had not merely been a military fortification, but a psychological and spiritual boundary, marked with temples and shrines, guarded by soldiers who worshipped gods both Roman and local. The Celtic tribes who had lived in the region before Roman arrival practiced a religion deeply concerned with boundaries and thresholds, with the spaces between worlds where spirits might cross. Heads held particular significance in this religion, seen as containers of power and consciousness, displayed at entrances and gateways, carved into stone and wood as permanent guardians. Severed heads of enemies were taken as trophies and displayed prominently, believed to transfer the dead warrior's strength to the victor. Carved heads served similar functions, capturing and directing spiritual force, protecting against evil, or in some cases imprisoning entities that required containment. Dr. Ross examined accounts of head cults throughout the Celtic world, from Ireland to Gaul, finding consistent themes. Heads were liminal objects, belonging neither fully to life nor death, representing the essence of a person separated from the body. Sacred springs often featured carved heads, the water flowing from stone mouths suggesting connections between heads and sources, between carved faces and the underworld from which water emerged. Shrines at boundary sites where roads crossed or territories met frequently incorporated head imagery, the stone faces watching travellers, marking transitions between safe space and wilderness. Some heads were protective, benevolent guardians keeping watch against harm. Others were apotropaic, frightening in appearance to ward off evil through fear. And some, according to fragmentary accounts preserved in later Christian texts that condemned pagan practices, were prisons, containers for malevolent spirits that had been captured through ritual and bound into stone so they could not harm the living. These spirit prison heads were buried rather than displayed, placed in the earth where they would be forgotten, where the entity within would remain contained for eternity or until some fool disturbed the burial and broke the binding. The Hexham heads matched descriptions of these prison heads more closely than any other category. They had been buried rather than displayed, positioned facing each other as though engaged in eternal confrontation or perhaps mutual containment. They radiated cold, a classical sign of spiritual presence in folklore across cultures. They resisted separation, always arranging themselves to face each other when left alone, suggesting connection or relationship between the two. And most significantly, they had brought something with them, something that manifested physically, something that walked and breathed and terrified every person who encountered it. Dr. Ross hypothesized that the heads might have been carved and buried during the late Roman period, when Celtic religion was being suppressed but still practiced in secret, when the old ways were dying but not yet dead. The area around Hadrian's Wall had been a cultural frontier, where Roman soldiers worshipped both imperial gods and local deities, where Celtic druids might have continued their practices out of sight of official disapproval. If a particularly dangerous entity had been loose in the region, terrorizing settlements or haunting a specific location, druids might have performed the necessary rituals to capture and bind it, carving prison heads and burying them with the entity contained within, protected by wards and prayers that would hold as long as the heads remained undisturbed. But this was speculation, built on fragmentary evidence and extrapolation from practices described in texts written by hostile observers who had every reason to exaggerate or misrepresent Celtic religion. Dr. Ross could not prove that the heads were ancient prison vessels any more than she could prove they were modern creations carved as garden ornaments. What she could document was the manifestations, the consistent pattern of phenomena that followed the heads wherever they went. She interviewed the Robson family, taking detailed statements about their experiences. She contacted Mrs. Dodd and her daughter, recording their accounts of the creature that had crossed from one house to the other. She spoke with the antiques dealer, the museum staff, every person who had possessed or examined the heads, building a case file that read less like archaeological documentation and more like evidence collection for a paranormal investigation. The testimonies were remarkably consistent. Cold spots, footsteps, objects moving. The creature itself, always described in similar terms, dark and massive, moving on four legs with a hunched back and oversized head, passing through walls, breathing with that distinctive wet sound, watching from darkness with whatever served it for vision. She documented her own experiences with clinical precision, noting dates and times, describing phenomena in neutral language, avoiding interpretation or emotional response. She recorded the footsteps that walked her hallway nightly, the door handles that turned when nothing visible touched them, the scratches on wood that appeared overnight. She photographed the frost that formed on windows in July, the condensation of breath in heated rooms, the physical evidence that temperature dropped precipitously in the presence of the heads. She set up recording equipment hoping to capture the creature's breathing or footsteps, but the devices failed consistently when the phenomenon occurred. Batteries draining instantly, tape refusing to record, cameras jamming, or producing only black frames. It was as though the presence actively resisted documentation, as though it existed in a state that precluded technological capture, or perhaps Dr. Ross thought in her darker moments it simply did not want to be recorded, did not want evidence of its existence preserved, and possessed enough agency to prevent such documentation. The scholarly community responded to her preliminary findings with skepticism bordering on hostility. Colleagues suggested she was suffering from stress or suggestion, that the phenomena could be explained through natural causes, that attributing supernatural origins to archaeological artifacts was a regression to pre-scientific thinking. The museum that had originally sent her the heads wanted them back, or more accurately wanted to be free of any association with them, and politely requested that she conclude her study quickly and return the objects to storage. The antiques dealer who had first displayed them called repeatedly asking when he might expect payment for facilitating the research, then stopped calling abruptly after experiencing renewed disturbances in his shop that he attributed to discussing the heads even at a distance. Everyone who had contact with the heads, directly or indirectly, wanted distance from them, wanted the investigation concluded, wanted the whole matter forgotten. But forgetting was not possible for those who had experienced the phenomena firsthand, who had heard the footsteps and seen the creature and felt the presence that walked with cold and darkness. The heads had opened something or revealed something or released something, and that something was not going to be easily dismissed or explained away by rational analysis. Dr. Ross continued her research through August, documenting everything, building a comprehensive file on the heads and their effects. She worked during the day and endured the nights when her house belonged to whatever the heads had brought with them, when she locked herself in her bedroom and listened to it walking the floors below, when she felt it testing her door and standing outside her window on the second story where nothing physical should have been able to stand. She was building toward a conclusion, a final assessment of what the heads were and what they represented, when something happened that would complicate the entire investigation and cast doubt on everything she'd documented. In late August, a letter arrived from Hexham from a man who had lived on Rede Avenue in the 1950s, who had read about the heads in a newspaper article about unexplained phenomena. He wrote to inform the investigators that the heads were not ancient at all, that he knew exactly where they had come from, and that the truth was far more prosaic than Celtic rituals or imprisoned spirits. The heads, he claimed, were modern creations, carved by him as toys for his daughter, buried in the garden when the family moved, and now the subject of mass hysteria and misidentification. The ancient artifacts that had terrified a neighbourhood and attracted scholarly attention were, according to this man, nothing more than concrete garden ornaments less than 20 years old. Chapter 8. The Rival. Vieri. The letter arrived at Dr. Ross's Southampton home on a morning in late August when the summer heat pressed against windows and made the interior of the house feel close and airless despite every window being opened wide. She recognised immediately that the envelope was from Northumberland. The postmark clearly marked Hexham, and she opened it with the mixture of hope and dread that had become her constant state since taking possession of the heads. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the handwriting careful and slightly old-fashioned, the kind that suggested someone educated in an earlier era when penmanship mattered. The writer identified himself as Desmond Craigie, a former resident of Rede Avenue who had lived at the address where the heads were found. Not the Robson house, but the property before it was subdivided in the early 1960s. He had read about the heads in the Newcastle Journal, he explained, in an article describing mysterious carved stones that had been unearthed and were now the subject of archaeological investigation. He felt compelled to write because the heads were not mysterious at all, at least not in their origin, and the investigation was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the objects actually were. Mr. Craigie explained in precise detail that in 1956 he had carved 2 heads from concrete as toys for his young daughter. She had wanted dolls' heads for some game or another, and he had obliged by mixing concrete and moulding it into crude face shapes, carving features with a screwdriver before the material fully hardened. The heads had been played with for a time and then forgotten, as children's toys inevitably were, left in the garden where they gradually became covered with soil and debris. When the family moved away in 1957, the heads remained buried, forgotten completely, until 2 boys digging 15 years later had unearthed them and set in motion a chain of events based entirely on misidentification and imagination. The heads were not ancient Celtic artefacts, not Romano-British cult objects, not prison vessels containing captured spirits. They were concrete dolls' heads, less than 20 years old, and all the phenomena attributed to them were the result of suggestion, coincidence, and the human tendency to find pattern and meaning in random events. Mr. Craigie offered to travel to Southampton if necessary to confirm his account, to demonstrate his concrete working technique, to provide any evidence that might settle the matter definitively. Dr. Ross read the letter 3 times, standing in her study where the heads sat in their box on the desk, and felt the careful structure of her investigation begin to crack. If Mr. Craigie's account was accurate, then everything she had documented, all the witness testimony and her own experiences, would be reinterpreted through the lens of modern psychology rather than ancient religion. The heads would become a case study in mass hysteria rather than evidence of lingering pagan power. Her academic credibility, already strained by her willingness to take the manifestation seriously, would be destroyed entirely if she had spent months studying concrete garden ornaments while claiming they were spiritually significant artifacts. She wanted to dismiss the letter immediately, to find holes in Mr. Craigie's story to protect her work from this intrusion of prosaic explanation. But intellectual honesty compelled her to investigate the claim thoroughly, to test it against the evidence she had gathered, to determine whether the heads could indeed be modern creations, despite all the phenomena associated with them. She contacted Mr. Craigie by telephone that afternoon, speaking with him at length about his recollections of creating the heads. His memory was detailed and specific, describing the type of concrete mix he had used, the mould he had improvised from a bowl and cloth, the screwdriver with which he had carved the features. He remembered his daughter's delight with the finished heads, remembered them being used in elaborate games in the back garden, remembered finding them months later half buried near the wall and leaving them there when the family relocated. His account had the ring of genuine memory rather than fabrication, the small inconsequential details that marked actual experience rather than constructed narrative. Dr. Ross asked whether he had photographs or any documentation, and he explained apologetically that most family photographs from that period had been lost in a house fire in the 1960s, that he had no physical evidence beyond his memory and his willingness to recreate the process. She invited him to Southampton, offering to pay his travel expenses, wanting to observe him making a comparable head, wanting to see if his technique could produce objects that matched the originals. Mr. Craigie arrived a week later, a retired man in his 60s with the careful movements and quiet manner of someone who had worked with his hands all his life. He examined the heads in Dr. Ross's study, turning them over, weighing them, and declared with confidence that these were indeed the objects he had made, that he recognised the proportions and the tool marks, that there was no doubt in his mind. Dr. Ross arranged for geological analysis of the material, and the results confirmed that the heads were composed of concrete rather than natural stone, concrete that had been moulded and carved rather than hewn from solid rock. The erosion that had suggested age was consistent with concrete weathering in damp soil, and the weight that had seemed wrong for stone was exactly right for concrete of this density and composition. The evidence supported Mr. Craigie's account completely, and Dr. Ross found herself confronting the possibility that her entire investigation had been built on false premises, that the heads were modern and mundane, that the phenomena attributed to them required entirely different explanation, but the phenomena themselves had not ceased. Even as Mr. Craigie sat in her study explaining the innocent origin of the heads, the temperature in the room remained unnaturally cold, frost forming on windows despite September warmth outside. That night, with Mr. Craigie staying at a nearby hotel, the manifestations continued as they had every night since the heads entered her home. Footsteps paced the hallway, objects moved. The creature walked through rooms with its heavy tread and wet breathing, and Dr. Ross lay awake listening to it, knowing that whether the heads were ancient or modern, whether they were carved from stone or moulded from concrete, something had attached itself to them, something that did not care about archaeological debates or material composition, something that walked and watched and filled houses with terror regardless of how the objects it inhabited had been created. In the morning, she found Mr. Craigie pale and shaken in the hotel lobby, reporting that he had experienced the worst night of his life, that his room had been freezing despite the heating, that he had heard footsteps in the corridor that stopped outside his door, that he had felt watched by something he could not see. He wanted to leave Southampton immediately, wanted distance from the heads he had created, and no amount of rational explanation could overcome the visceral fear of what he had experienced. Dr. Ross drove him to the railway station and watched him board the train back to Northumberland, his relief at departing visible in every line of his body. She returned to her house and sat in the study with the heads, understanding that Mr. Craigie's revelation had solved nothing. Yes, the heads were modern concrete rather than ancient stone. Yes, they had been created as innocent toys rather than ritual objects. But these facts did not explain why every person who possessed them experienced identical phenomena, why the creature manifested consistently across multiple locations, why houses became cold and objects moved, and footsteps echoed through empty rooms. If the heads were not genuinely ancient cult objects, if they contained no imprisoned spirits from Celtic ritual, then what was happening required a different framework for understanding. Perhaps, Dr. Ross theorized, the heads had become charged with power not through their creation, but through their burial and subsequent belief. Perhaps the act of burying face-shaped objects in the earth near Hadrian's wall, in ground that had been sacred to Celtic peoples for millennia, had been enough to attract or attach something that dwelled in that place, something that had been waiting for a vessel, for a form through which it could enter the human world. Or perhaps, and this thought troubled her more deeply, the age and origin of the heads were irrelevant, that what mattered was the human response to them, the fear and attention and belief that had accumulated around them since their unearthing. Every person who had possessed the heads had experienced phenomena. Every account had been shared with others, building a narrative of cursed objects and supernatural manifestations. Perhaps that narrative itself had become powerful enough to generate reality, the collective belief creating or sustaining the very phenomena it described. Dr. Ross had studied enough folklore to know that cursed objects required belief to function, that the power attributed to talismans and fetishes derived from the weight of human attention focused upon them. The heads had been treated as significant from the moment of their discovery, had been discussed and studied and feared, had been the subject of newspaper articles and scholarly investigation and neighbourhood gossip. Perhaps all that attention had made them powerful, had created channels through which something could manifest, regardless of whether the original objects were ancient stone or modern concrete. This theory troubled her because it suggested that her own investigation might have contributed to the problem, that by taking the head seriously, by documenting phenomena and treating manifestations as worthy of study, she'd strengthened whatever force was attached to them. She remembered the colleague who had suggested that head-shaped objects could serve as prisons for entities, and wondered if the reverse might also be true. If head-shaped objects could serve as doorways, as portals through which something could enter from wherever it had been before. The heads had faces, crude and simplified but recognizable as human features, and faces in folklore across cultures served as thresholds, as meeting points between the viewer and the viewed, as surfaces where identity could be recognized and connection established. Perhaps by creating faces, even accidentally, even as toys, Mr. Craigie had created something that could be inhabited, and by burying those faces in ground saturated with centuries of belief and ritual, he had provided an anchor point for something that needed faces to manifest, that used carved features as windows through which to see and be seen. She wrote up her findings carefully, documenting both the archaeological investigation and Mr. Craigie's account, presenting the evidence for modern origin alongside the testimony of consistent supernatural phenomena. Her report was thorough and methodical, acknowledging the contradiction at its heart, the impossibility of reconciling prosaic origin with extraordinary effects. She submitted it to journals and received polite rejections, editors suggesting that the material was more suited to publications focused on folklore or paranormal investigation than to serious archaeological scholarship. Her colleagues at the university grew distant, uncomfortable with her association with old objects that generated sensational newspaper coverage and public fascination with the supernatural. Her academic reputation, carefully built over years of serious research, began to erode as she became known not as a Celtic scholar, but as the woman who studied cursed dolls' heads. She understood that she had crossed a boundary in her profession, that by taking the manifestations seriously she had violated an unspoken rule of modern scholarship that required dismissing such phenomena as superstition or misperception. The price of her honesty was professional isolation, but she could not bring herself to lie, to claim the phenomena did not occur, to dismiss the experiences of multiple witnesses, including herself, as mere imagination. Chapter 9. The Vanishing. By October 1971, Dr. Ross had reached a decision that every previous owner of the heads had reached before her. They could not remain in her house. The nightly disturbances had not diminished or expimed, despite Mr. Craigie's revelation about their modern origin, had, if anything, intensified, as though the entity attached to them resented the attempt to diminish their significance by revealing their prosaic creation. The creature walked her hallway every night, its footsteps heavier now, more insistent, and she had begun to feel that it was not merely present in her house, but actively hostile toward her, punishing her for attempting to understand it, for trying to contain it within academic frameworks and rational explanation. She woke repeatedly to find her bedroom door open, though she had locked it, woke to find the creature standing at the foot of her bed, its dark shape visible against the window, watching her with whatever passed for its attention. She had stopped sleeping more than an hour or two each night, had begun to experience the same exhaustion and deterioration that had plagued the Robson family, and she knew that she could not continue indefinitely in this state. She contacted the museum in Newcastle, informing them that her investigation was complete and requesting that they take possession of the heads for their permanent collection or storage. The museum declined politely but firmly, explaining that they had no space for objects of uncertain provenance and questionable historical value, that the heads had generated more controversy than scholarly interest, and that they preferred not to be associated with items that attracted sensational attention. Dr. Ross understood the refusal, understood that the heads had become radioactive in academic circles, that no institution wanted the liability or embarrassment of possessing objects linked to supernatural claims. She tried the British Museum, smaller regional collections, university archaeology departments, anywhere that might accept the heads and take them off her hands. Every institution declined. The heads had become unpossessable in official terms, too controversial to display, too modern to justify as archaeological specimens, too associated with disturbing phenomena to be welcomed into any collection. She considered destroying them, taking a hammer to the concrete and reducing them to rubble that could be disposed of anonymously, but she hesitated, remembering accounts from previous owners who had attempted to bury or discard the heads, remembering how they had returned, had dug themselves up or appeared on doorsteps, had refused to be banished. She feared that destruction might release rather than contain whatever was attached to them, that breaking the physical forms might free the entity to manifest without constraint, without the anchor of carved faces to limit or focus its presence. So she did what others had done, what seemed the only viable option. She found someone willing to take them, someone who expressed interest in supposedly cursed objects, someone who collected items with dark histories and displayed them in a private museum of the macabre. This collector, a wealthy man with holdings throughout England, agreed to add the heads to his collection, intrigued by their notoriety and unconcerned by warnings about their effects. Dr. Ross packed them carefully, drove them to his estate in the Midlands, and handed them over with a relief so profound it was almost physical. For 3 weeks she slept soundly, for the first time since bringing the heads to Southampton. Her house returned to normal temperature. Objects stayed where she placed them. The hallway remained empty at night. No footsteps, no breathing, no presence testing her locked door. She resumed her normal academic work, writing papers on uncontroversial topics, lecturing on Celtic symbolism without reference to her recent investigation, trying to rebuild credibility that had been damaged by her association with the heads. She did not contact the collector, did not inquire about his experience with them, wanted only distance and forgetfulness, wanted to move forward as though the entire episode had not occurred. But 3 weeks after delivering the heads, the collector telephoned her in the middle of the night, his voice tight with panic and rage. His estate had been plagued by disturbances from the moment the heads arrived, he said. His dogs would not enter the room where they were displayed. His staff had resigned en masse. His wife had left, claiming the house was no longer habitable. And he himself had seen the creature, had encountered it on the stairs of his own home, had felt its presence and understood for the first time that the warnings he had dismissed were understated, if anything, that the heads were more dangerous than any object in his collection, that he wanted them gone immediately and he would hold Dr. Ross responsible for any damages they caused. She refused to take them back, explaining that she had fulfilled her obligation by warning him and that he had accepted them with full knowledge of their history. But she felt guilty nevertheless, felt that she had passed the curse along like a disease, had infected someone else with the nightmare she had barely escaped. The collector disposed of the heads himself, though how he did so remained unclear. Some accounts suggested he buried them on his property, others that he threw them into a reservoir, still others that he destroyed them despite the risks and scattered the fragments. Whatever he did, the heads disappeared from documented record after that point in late 1971. Dr. Ross never saw them again, never learned their final disposition, and no subsequent owner came forward reporting their discovery or possession. The heads had entered the world through excavation in a Hexham garden in February, had passed through multiple hands over 9 months, and had vanished in autumn as though they had never existed. Only the testimony remained, the accounts of those who had possessed them, the documentation of phenomena that multiple witnesses had experienced, and the photographs that Dr. Ross had taken during her investigation. Photographs that showed 2 crude concrete heads with hollow eyes and gashed mouths, objects that looked entirely harmless in 2-dimensional representation, that revealed nothing of the cold they generated, or the presence they carried, or the creature that walked wherever they went. The story might have ended there, with the heads vanished and the witnesses scattered, each bearing their private trauma and speaking of it only rarely and with reluctance. But the mystery of the heads' disappearance became almost as compelling as the mystery of their effects. Researchers in subsequent decades attempted to track them down, to locate the collector who had last possessed them, to determine what had actually happened after he took delivery. They found the collector easily enough. A man named Hugh Beresford, who had indeed maintained a private collection of supposedly cursed objects, but Beresford refused to discuss the heads, became hostile when questioned about them, and threatened legal action against anyone who persisted in inquiring. His estate staff, those who had worked there in 1971 and could still be located years later, confirmed that something terrible had happened after the heads arrived, that the household had been disrupted completely, that several staff members had experienced psychological breakdowns and one had been hospitalised, but they provided no details and would not specify what they had seen or experienced. The heads had vanished into the same darkness from which they had emerged, and Beresford apparently intended to keep the details of their disposal secret. Dr. Ross continued her academic career, publishing extensively on Celtic religion and becoming a respected authority in her field, but she never again investigated objects that claimed supernatural significance, never returned to the territory where scholarship met the inexplicable. In interviews late in her life, she spoke carefully about the heads, confirming the basic facts of her investigation, but avoiding sensational detail, acknowledging that she had experienced phenomena she could not explain, but refusing to speculate about their ultimate meaning or origin. She maintained that the heads were genuine artifacts in the sense that they had genuine effects, that whether they were ancient or modern was less important than the fact that they had carried or attracted something that manifested consistently across multiple contexts. She suggested that objects could become powerful through use and belief, that faces carved into any material might serve as focal points for forces that existed in landscape and place, forces that predated human civilization and continued to exist in the margins where wilderness met settlement, where the past pressed against the present, where the carefully constructed modern world revealed itself to be thinner and more fragile than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The neighbourhood on Rede Avenue eventually returned to normal, or appeared to return to normal. The Robson family never came back, settling in Durham and refusing to discuss their experiences with anyone outside the immediate family. Mrs. Dodd sold her house and moved to Newcastle, unwilling to spend another night separated only by a wall from the place where the heads had been unearthed. New families moved into the properties, unaware of the history, and experienced nothing unusual or nothing they reported. The garden where the heads had been buried remained undisturbed, no subsequent excavation revealing what else might be hidden in the soil, what other objects might be waiting in the earth for careless hands to uncover them. The spot where Colin and Leslie Robson had dug on that February afternoon in 1971 was eventually paved over when the landlord expanded the property, concrete covering the earth, sealing whatever remained below. Whether this was deliberate, whether the landlord knew the history and chose to prevent further disturbance was never confirmed. The house stood quiet, its rooms are no longer cold, its hallways empty of footsteps, as though the removal of the heads had severed the connection between place and presence, as though whatever had walked there had followed the heads when they departed, and now walked elsewhere, in other houses, other corridors, wherever the carved faces had gone. Chapter 10. The Memory Remains. More than 50 years have passed since two boys dug in a Hexham garden and found carved heads that should have remained buried. The witnesses to the events of 1971 are elderly now, or have passed beyond reach of earthly inquiry. Their testimony preserved in archived interviews and written statements, but their living voices largely silent. The heads themselves have never resurfaced, have not appeared in auction catalogues or museum collections, have not been reported found in excavations or construction sites, have vanished as thoroughly as though they never existed. But the story persists in Northumberland, told and retold, embellished and debated, a local legend that attracts researchers and paranormal investigators, journalists and curious tourists who walk Rede Avenue looking for the house where it began, though most could no longer identify which property it was, as the street has changed and the old terraces have been renovated beyond recognition of their 1970s appearance. The academic establishment has largely dismissed the Hexham heads as a case of mass hysteria combined with opportunistic fraud, suggesting that after Mr. Craigie revealed the modern origin of the heads, any continued belief in their supernatural properties was psychological rather than genuine, that the phenomena reported were products of suggestion and expectation rather than objective occurrence. Skeptics point to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of photographic or recorded documentation of the creature, the fact that all testimony is subjective and unverifiable. They note that the heads disappeared before rigorous scientific investigation could be conducted, that Dr. Ross's research, while thorough in documentation, relied heavily on witness testimony that could have been influenced by suggestion and media coverage. The whole episode, from this perspective, was an example of how intelligent people could convince themselves of supernatural occurrences when presented with ambiguous objects and exposed to a narrative framework that encouraged belief in the paranormal. The heads were concrete dolls' heads, nothing more, and the phenomena attributed to them were explainable through cold spots caused by drafts, footsteps explained by settling houses and active imaginations, and mass panic generated by a few initial reports that spiraled into collective delusion. But this dismissive explanation fails to account for the consistency of testimony across multiple witnesses who had no contact with each other, who experienced identical phenomena before learning of others' experiences, who described the creature in remarkably similar terms despite having no opportunity to coordinate their accounts. The Robson family saw it before they knew the Dodds had seen it. Dr. Ross encountered it before learning the details of previous witnesses' descriptions. Mr. Craigie, who had every reason to believe the heads were harmless objects of his own creation, experienced phenomena identical to what others reported. The pattern of manifestations remained constant. Footsteps and cold and objects moving, and the creature itself, always described with the same hunched back and oversized head, always moving through walls, always breathing with that distinctive wet sound. This consistency suggests either a genuine phenomenon or a level of coordination and conspiracy that seems implausible given the number of witnesses involved and their lack of any obvious motive for fabrication. Why would a respected academic risk her career by documenting phenomena she knew to be false? Why would multiple families abandon their homes over imaginary disturbances? Why would a museum refuse possession of objects that generated publicity and public interest if there was no genuine reason for concern? The truth, as it often does, likely lies somewhere between complete dismissal and absolute belief. Perhaps the heads were modern concrete creations, as Mr. Craigie claimed, but perhaps their burial in ground that had been sacred or significant for millennia allowed them to become something more than their materials and origin suggested. Perhaps the act of digging them up, of disturbing what had been buried and forgotten, created a rupture through which something could enter, not because the heads themselves were powerful, but because their disturbance marked a threshold, a moment when the boundary between past and present, between buried and exposed, became permeable. The landscape around Hadrian's Wall had been a frontier for 2,000 years, a place where different worlds met and sometimes bled into each other, where Roman order confronted Celtic wilderness, where Christianity supplanted older religions without entirely erasing them. Perhaps places hold memory, hold the accumulated weight of everything that has happened within their boundaries, and perhaps certain acts, like excavation or construction or burial, could stir that memory into something approaching consciousness or manifestation. Or perhaps the explanation is simpler and stranger. Perhaps faces carved into any material, whether ancient stone or modern concrete, could serve as anchors for attention, as focal points where human perception and whatever exists beyond human perception could meet and interact. Faces are how humans recognize consciousness, how we identify others like ourselves. And faces looking out from inanimate objects create a paradox, a signal of consciousness where no consciousness should be. Perhaps that paradox, that contradiction between face and object, between the suggestion of presence and the reality of absence, creates a space where something can enter, where the thing that should not be can find a way to become. The heads had faces, crude but unmistakable, and those faces looked out from stone or concrete with the same fixed gaze that icons and masks have used for thousands of years to suggest the presence of something beyond the material, something that watches back when we watch it. And perhaps by creating faces and burying them, Mr. Craigie had accidentally performed a ritual as old as human civilization, had created a vessel that could be inhabited, and the thing that inhabited it had simply been waiting for the opportunity, waiting in the earth or the air or wherever such things wait, ready to manifest when given the form and the invitation. The people of Hexham who remember the story have their own opinions, shaped by proximity and local knowledge, and the particular character of Northumberland folklore that has always acknowledged the darkness beneath ordinary life. They know that the landscape is old, older than names or nations, and the old places have their own rules, their own inhabitants, their own ways of asserting themselves against human presumption. They know that walls built by Roman emperors have not prevented the wild places from pressing in, that Celtic gods did not die when their worshippers converted or were conquered, that the past is not safely distant but always present, always waiting for someone to dig deep enough to unearth it. The Hexham heads in this understanding were not unique but representative, a single instance of something that could happen anywhere the earth has been long occupied, anywhere the dead outnumber the living, anywhere the careful surface of modern life grows thin enough to reveal what lies beneath. The heads were a warning, perhaps, or a reminder that the world contains more than material objects and explicable phenomena, that there are territories where rationality cannot fully penetrate, where the old darkness persists despite electric light and scientific method, and the comfortable assumption that the modern world has banished mystery. The story has entered popular culture, inspiring books and television documentaries, appearing in collections of British folklore and paranormal case studies, becoming part of the cultural landscape the same way the heads themselves became part of the literal landscape before being dug up and lost again. New generations discover the story and debate its meaning, some convinced of supernatural origin, others certain of natural explanation, most falling somewhere between, acknowledging that something happened even if its ultimate nature remains unclear. The photographs of the heads circulate online, those images that Dr. Ross took during her investigation, showing two small concrete objects with carved faces, innocuous in daylight, revealing nothing of what they reportedly carried with them. People study the photographs looking for clues, looking for something in the crude features that might explain the terror they generated, but the faces remain inscrutable, neither benevolent nor malevolent, simply present, simply watching with their hollow eyes, their gashed mouths suggesting speech or screaming, or the silence of stone that knows more than it can tell. And somewhere perhaps the heads still exist, buried again or hidden or destroyed but not quite gone, their influence persisting in memory and story even if their physical forms have been lost. The creature they brought with them, that thing that walked on four legs through walls and watched from darkness and breathed with the sound of water in lungs, has not been reported in recent years, has not terrorized new families or driven scholars from their homes. Perhaps it has returned to wherever it came from. Perhaps it has found other vessels or other thresholds. Perhaps it was never more than the collective nightmare of stressed witnesses who convinced each other of its reality. Or perhaps it simply waits, patient as stone, patient as earth, patient as everything that has outlasted civilizations and will outlast this one, waiting for the next disturbance, the next excavation, the next moment when someone digs in cold ground and finds something that should have remained buried, something with a face carved into its surface, something that watches back when we look at it, Something that has all the time in the world and knows that eventually, inevitably, someone will always dig deep enough to let it back in. The candle burned low, the chamber felt ill, and history once again turned the page in the dark, leaving behind only questions and testimony, and the fading memory of two small heads that appeared from the earth for 9 months in 1971, and then vanished back into the darkness they had come from, taking with them whatever walked in their shadow, whatever breathed in empty rooms, whatever crossed the threshold between the buried past and the waking present, and reminded everyone who encountered it that the world is older and stranger than daylight reveals, that some doors once opened can never be fully closed, and that the earth holds secrets that are buried for good reason, secrets that should remain undisturbed in the cold ground where they belong, where they have always belonged, where they wait still beneath our feet in the patient darkness, waiting for the next hand to reach down and pull them back into the light. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the shadowed history of the Hexham Heads. I hope this story has accompanied you well through these quiet hours. If you found this tale compelling, please consider subscribing to the Bedside Historian for more explorations of history's darker corners. Until we meet again in the darkness, sleep well and remember that some stories are best left buried.